Cypherpunks, Freedom and the Future of the Internet. By Julian Assange. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Chapter 8. The Internet and Politics. Chapter 9. The Internet and Economics. Chapter 10. Censorship. Chapter 11. Privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Chapter 12. Rats in the Opera House. Chapter 8. The Internet and Politics. Jeremy, it is interesting to see the power of the hackers in the primary sense of the term, not a criminal. A hacker is a technology enthusiast, somebody who likes to understand how technology works, not to be trapped into technology but to make it work better. I suppose that when you were 5 or 7 you had a screwdriver and tried to open devices to understand what it was like inside. This is what being a hacker is, and hackers built the internet for many reasons, including because it was fun, and they have developed it and have given the internet to everybody else. Companies like Google and Facebook saw the opportunity to then build business models based on capturing users' personal data. But still we see a form of power in the hands of hackers. My primary interest these days is that we see these hackers gaining power, even in the political arenas. In the US there has been this SOPA, Stop Online Piracy Act, and PIPA, Protect IP Act, legislation, violent copyright legislation that basically gives Hollywood the power to order any internet company to restrict access and to censor the internet. Julian. And banking blockades like the one WikiLeaks is suffering from. Jeremy. Exactly. What happened to WikiLeaks from the banking companies was becoming the standard method to fight the evil copyright pirates that killed Hollywood and so on. And we witnessed this tremendous uproar from civil society on the internet, and not only in the US, it couldn't have worked if it was only US citizens who rose up against SOPA and PIPA. It was people all around the world that participated, and hackers were at the core of it and were providing tools to the others to help participate in the public debate. Julian. To help build the campaign. Jeremy. Was it on Tumblr or some site like this where the homepage lets you enter your phone number and you'll be called back and put in touch with the Congress? And you would just start talking with somebody and say, yeah, this is bullshit. Jacob. The internet was used in defense of itself. Jeremy. I think we hackers have a responsibility towards the tools we build and hand out to the rest of the world, and we may be witnessing the beginning of how efficiently this responsibility can be put into action when we use it collectively. Today in the EU there is the ACTA debate. ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, is a multinational treaty that is the blueprint for SOPA and PIPA. I just came back from the European Parliament where we as individuals, beardy smelly individuals, were dictating to one parliamentary committee. We were showing them articles in the Rules of Procedure in the European Parliament that apparently they were looking at for the first time and told them how to behave, and there was this vote that we won by 21-5 which marginalised the British rapporteur in a small corner. This is a very small part of a small procedural point on the way towards defeating ACTA, this monstrous global agreement that has been designed behind our backs to circumvent democracy itself. But we may as citizens be able to kill that monster easily, with the internet tools, the mailing lists, the wikis, the IRC chat rooms, etc., and I think that we may be witnessing the coming of age, the teenage years of the internet and the way that it can be used by society at large to try to make things change. I think it is of tremendous importance that we hackers are here with our technical knowledge to guide people and to tell them, you should use this technology that enables control over your privacy rather than Facebook or Google, and that the two articulate together quite well or may articulate together quite well. This is a small bit of optimism. Julian. Jake, on this political radicalization of internet youth, over the past 2 years especially you've been all over the world talking about Tor, talking to people who want anonymity, who want privacy in relation to their own government, and you must have seen this phenomenon in many different countries. Is it something significant? Jacob. Sure. I think it is absolutely significant. The canonical example that I think of immediately is going to Tunisia. I went to Tunisia after Ben Ali's regime fell and we talked about Tor in a computer science class, which includes some very technical people at the university, and someone raised their hand and said, but what about the bad people? And she rattled off the 4 horsemen of the infopocalypse: money laundering, drugs, terrorism and child pornography. What about the bad people? Those 4 things are always brought out and the spectre of them is used to shoot down privacy-preserving technologies, because clearly we have to defeat those 4 groups. So I asked the class, who here has ever seen the AMA 404 page, which is the censorship page deployed by the Ben Ali regime before and during the revolution in order to stop access? Every single person in the room, except the person that asked that question, but including the professor in the class, raised their hand. And I looked at the girl who asked this question and I said, look at all the people around you. That's all of your classmates. Do you really believe that it was worth oppressing every person in this room in order to fight against those things? And she said, actually, I'm raising my hand too. It was a little more drawn out than that, but essentially people who have it contextualized for them realize what the real deal is. That changes things dramatically. And this happens all over the world, all the time, but it usually happens later. That is, people see in hindsight that they could have used the technology. They see in hindsight that, oh yeah, it turns out it's not just bad people because, in fact, I am the bad person if I speak my mind about something and a person in power doesn't like what I have to say about it. And you see that there's an awakening. But it is wrong to say that it just happened in the last couple of years. I'm sorry to do this to you, Julian, but you are part of the radicalization of my generation. I'm like a 3rd-generation cypherpunk if I were to count it that way. The work that you and Ralph Weinman did on the rubber-hose file system was part of what inspired me to work on cryptosystems. The crypto file system I designed, called MAID, was in response to things like the regulatory investigative powers in the United Kingdom, where basically the state has decided negative regulation is the solution to cryptography, where they can take your password. Of course, in Julian's case when they created this it was because oppressive regimes would torture people for a passphrase, so you had to be able to give up different passphrases in order to comply with their torture. My cryptofile system, MAID, was designed for a legal system where the accused has the right to remain silent but can prove, if compelled, that they are telling the truth without violating confidentiality. I had realized when I saw Julian's work that you could use technology to empower everyday people to change the world. Going far, far back to the old Cypherpunk mailing list with Tim May, one of the founding members of it, and reading Julian's old posts on the Cypherpunk list, that's what started a whole generation of people to really become more radicalized, because people realized that they weren't atomized anymore, that they could take some time to write some software which could empower millions of people. There are just some unintended consequences with how that played out, because the people that created Google didn't start out to create Google, to create the greatest surveillance machine that ever existed. But in effect that is what has been created, and as soon as people start to realize it they'll start sending in those national security letters, right? Jeremy, I think there are 3 crucial points in what you just said. Jacob, just 3? Jeremy, among others. ANDY, okay, let me add number 4 maybe, yeah? Jacob, you don't even know what they are yet. Jeremy, I see 3 points that are intertwined. I'm not saying they should be taken separately, but one of them is authoritarian regimes and the powers that authoritarian regimes have in an era of digital technologies. In the case of the Ben Ali regime, it is obvious in so many regimes today you can decide what people can learn about, or who they can communicate with. This is of tremendous power and this should be opposed, and the internet, a free internet, is a tool for opposing that. Another point is building tools and better technology that can try to root around such problems as censorship, but basically building tools that are part of that infrastructure that helps us topple dictators. And yet another issue is the political storytelling you evoked with the 4 horsemen of the infopocalypse, the pretexts that are used every day by politicians through the media. Are we all going to die of terrorism? Therefore we need a Patriot Act. Child pornographers are everywhere. There are pedonazis all over the internet. Therefore we need censorship. Jacob, pedonazis? Jeremy, pedonazis, yeah, pedo-nazi.com is reserved already. Artists are going to die and there won't be cinema anymore, therefore we have to give Hollywood the power to censor the internet, and so on. I think here again the internet is a tool, an antidote to the political storytelling. The political storytelling relies on emotionality and a media time frame that is of extremely short span. Information appears and disappears 24 hours afterwards and is replaced by new information. With the internet, I get the feeling that we're building what I call internet time. As the great internet never forgets, we can build dossiers over years, day after day, and we can elaborate, we can analyze. This is what we've been doing for the last 3 years with ACTA. Once again, WikiLeaks has been an inspiration to us because the first version of ACTA that got leaked was leaked to WikiLeaks in 2008. Julian: yes, we picked it up. Jeremy: and we leaked 2 versions ourselves. There are 5 versions of the text over 3 years that we could take and paragraph by paragraph, line by line, say this is doing that, this is the industry asking for this, and involve legal experts and technology experts and build a version of political storytelling that was different from the official, oh, we need ACTA to save culture and save children from fake medications, and such. And so we built our own political line with internet time, with precise analysis, with hard work, with connecting people together to participate in that. Julian: that's true, and I think that view of ACTA has won the public. Jeremy: so far, so good. Julian: that I think will be the historical view, but behind the scenes this so-called anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which was originated by the US copyright industry, has actually been used in a whole lot of bilateral treaties to try and create a new international regime about what is legal and what is not legal as far as publishing is concerned, and what mechanisms there are to stop people from publishing various things. It standardizes a harsher version of the US DMCA system, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, under which if you send someone a letter demanding they take something down from the internet, they have to take it down, and there is some sort of 2-week process where they can make counter-arguments and so on, but because it is expensive for any ISP publisher to deal with the counter-argument, they just take it down immediately, and they allow the author or the uploader to try and fight it out themselves. The effect of it has been quite severe in the US, in removing a whole bunch of content. Scientology abused it to remove literally thousands of videos from YouTube. So let's assume that ACTA has been knocked out in the European Parliament, actually successfully, at least this iteration. But the main developments of ACTA seem to be occurring anyway. We've had the democratic debate, ACTA has been demonized in the public sphere, we've won the narrative, but behind the scenes secret bilateral treaties have been set up which are achieving the same result. It has just subverted the democratic process. For example, WikiLeaks got hold of and released the new EU-India Free Trade Agreement, and incorporated in that are large chunks of ACTA. That has been happening to a number of other agreements and legislation. The ACTA head might well get cut off, but the body will split into a few bits and they will all worm their way into things, into the international order in the form of all these bilateral treaties. So you can have your democratic victories that take place in public, on the surface, but underneath things are still done anyway. Which is to show that I don't think that policy or legislative reform is the way, although you can't give the opponent a free kick either, because then they just accelerate. So it is important to check them in various ways, as ACTA is being checked. It slows them down. But even a win in Parliament in relation to legislation doesn't stop this below-the-surface activity. Jacob: one thing that I think really has to be pointed out is that Roger Dingledine, one of the creators of Tor, who I would say is sort of my mentor and has really given me a lot to think about with regard to censorship circumvention and anonymity online, talks about how, for example, firewalls are not just technically successful, and it is important to understand the technology behind them if you wish to build technology to resist them, but they are socially successful. People who are fighting against ACTA are using technology and the technology enables them to resist, but it is in fact the agency of everyday people that it's important to understand here, and technobabble is not the thing that is important. What matters is people actually getting involved in that narrative and changing it while they still have the power to do so, and the human aspect of that is, in fact, the most important part. WikiLeaks has released documents that enable that, and the information sharing is important, but it is also the people who take that important information and actually move it who matter. Because there is at least the argument that many of us might live in a democracy, that we are free, that it is supposed to be that we are governed through consent. And so if everyone understands what is going on and we find it is not something we consent to, then it is very difficult to keep going and just pass those as laws and do it without the consent of those that are governed. Jeremy: it's about increasing the political costs of taking those bad decisions for the ones who take them, and we can do that collectively with a free internet as long as we have it between our hands. Jacob: but you could do it without an internet also, because we have, historically, had free societies pre-internet. It was just economically more expensive, it was more difficult in some ways, and this is actually why the peer-to-peer movement is so important. NDY, point number 4 is, I think, The architectural dimension of decentralized systems is a core thing that also needs to be put in the hands of the people, because now we have this centralized cloud computing. Julian, we have Facebook completely centralized. Twitter completely centralized. Google completely centralized. All in the United States, all controllable by whoever controls coercive force. Just like the censorship that started after WikiLeaks released Cablegate, when Amazon dropped our site from its servers. NDY, and we have cloud computing providing an economic incentive for companies to have a cheaper way of processing their data in so-called international data centers run by US corporations, which means bringing the data into US jurisdictions, just like the payment companies and so on. Julian, there is a tendency within the shift to cloud computing that is quite worrying. There are enormous clusters of servers all in one location, because it is more efficient to standardize control of the environment, to standardize the payment system. It is a competitive technique because piling up servers in the one location is cheaper than spreading them out. Most of the communication that occurs on the internet, except for streaming movies, is between server and server, so if you put the servers closer together it is cheaper. We end up with these big hives of communicating servers. It makes sense for Google, for example, to put its servers near the big content providers, or the other way around, because the pages are indexed by Google to be searchable. So there are huge buildings in the US that are just completely filled with servers from many different companies. That's where the NSA places some of its mass interception collection points. The internet could exist without this centralization. It's not that the technology is impossible, it's just that it is simply more efficient to have it centralized. In economic competition, the centralized version wins out. And why? While the architectural point of view is very important to understand, centralized infrastructures make central control and abuse of power very easy. This is also like killing the small supermarket next door with a centralized retail concept. Julian, and going to a big multinational like Safeway. NDY, yes, the same way that it happened with shopping. It's very important to keep up a decentralized infrastructure approach. When I was part of Econ, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which makes and regulates the domain names on the Internet, I learned something from Vince Cerf, who invented at least part of the TCP/IP protocol, the fundamental communication protocol of the Internet. He always used to say, one good thing about governments is they're never singular, they're always in plural. So even among governments, there are those that want to have their own decentralized range of power, and even within governments there are different factions fighting with each other. That is finally what is going to save us from Big Brother, because there are going to be too many who want to be Big Brother and they will have fights amongst each other. Julian, I don't think so, Andy. I think once upon a time we had national elites that were competitive with each other, and now they're linking together and they're lifting off their respective populations. And why? They are linking together. You are right in that respect, and I'm not so sure it's really going to save our ass, but there is the chance of actually keeping our own identity. We have to stick to our own infrastructure. That's the important thing to learn here, that if we want to oppose the surveillance state, the one Big Brother, we have to study what that is, whether it is indeed a linking of central states that say, hey, if we combine we can gain even more. And we need to know what our role is here. Our role is to keep decentralized, have our own infrastructure, not rely on cloud computing and other bullshit, but have our own thing. Julian, but we may have this domination of technique. If it's a fact that it's easier to use Twitter than start your own Twitter, if it's a fact that it's easier to use Facebook than Diaspora, or some alternative, if it's a fact that cloud computing is cheaper, then these techniques and services will dominate. It's not a matter of saying that we should start our own local services, because these local services simply will not be competitive, and they will only ever be used by a small minority of people. We need something better than saying that we should have a poor man's version of Facebook and expect people to use it. And why? Well, coming back to the Catholic Church, we're going back to times where there is one major issuer of books, as Amazon is trying to control the complete supply chain of ebooks, so we must keep our own printing publishing capabilities. This might sound a bit overreaching, but we have seen what these companies can do if they or the governmental agencies they depend on in their jurisdiction don't want stuff to be happening. And I think the next step will obviously have to be that we need our own money, so that even if they don't like the fact that we support projects like WikiLeaks or whatever, we have our own way to do that without relying on a central infrastructure which all goes through one jurisdiction. Jeremy, I would like to agree with Andy. I think that architecture matters and this is central to everything we stand for. But this is a message that we have a responsibility to convey to the public, because we understand it, as hackers, as technicians who build the internet every day and play with it. And maybe this is a way to win the hearts and minds of the younger generations. I think this is why the copyright wars are so essential, because with peer-to-peer technologies, since Napster in 1999, people just understood, got it, that by sharing files between individuals. Julian, you're a criminal. Jeremy, no, you build better culture. Julian, no, you're a criminal. Jeremy, that's the storytelling, but if you build a better culture for yourself, everybody will use Napster. And why? The history of the human race and the history of culture is the history of copying thoughts, modifying and processing them further on, and if you call it stealing, then you're like all the cynics. Jeremy, exactly. Culture is meant to be shared. Julian, well, in the West since the 1950s we've had industrial culture. Our culture has become an industrial product. Jeremy, we are feeding the troll here because he's playing the devil's advocate and he's doing it very well. Jacob, I'm not biting. It's such obvious bullshit. Jeremy, it is bullshit. In the political storytelling it is called stealing, but I want to make my point that everybody who used Napster back in 1999 became a music fan and then went to concerts and became a descriptor telling everybody, you should listen to those people, you should go to that concert and so on. So people have had a practical example of how peer-to-peer technology decentralized the architecture. Actually, Napster was a bit centralized back at that time, but it seeded the idea of a decentralized architecture. Everybody had a concrete example where a decentralized architecture brought good to society, and when it is about sharing culture it is exactly the same as when it is about sharing knowledge. Sharing of knowledge is what we're talking about when we're discussing rooting around censorship, or cutting through the political storytelling to build a better democratic system and to make society better. So, we have examples where decentralized services and sharing between individuals makes things better, and the counterexample is the devil's advocate Julian is playing, where an industry comes and says, oh, this is stealing and this is killing everybody, killing actors, killing Hollywood, killing cinema, killing kittens and everything. They have won battles in the past and now we may be about to win the ACTA battle. And I once again have to disagree with the devil's advocate Julian was playing earlier. ACTA has been the greatest example of the circumvention of democracy so far, of sitting on the face of Parliament and the international institutions, sitting on the face of public opinion and imposing unacceptable measures through the back door. If we manage to kick that out, then we will set a precedent, then we will have an opportunity to push for a positive agenda, to say, ACTA is over, now let's go and do something that really goes in the favor of the public. And we're working towards that, and some members of the European Parliament now understand that when individuals share things, when they share files without a profit, they shouldn't go to jail, they shouldn't be punished. I think that if we manage that one we have a strong case for exposing to the rest of the world that the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of information, makes things better, that we have to promote it and not fight it, and that any attempt, whether it's legislative or from a dictator or from a company, to hurt our ability to share information and share knowledge in a decentralized way must be opposed, period. I think we can build momentum. Julian, what about the PEPA-SOPA debate in the US? This is new legislation proposed in the US Congress to create financial embargoes and internet blockades on behalf of US industries. Jacob, it was created specifically to attack WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks-related or WikiLeaks-like things that exist. Julian, in Congress the banking blockade against us was specifically mentioned as an effective tool. Jeremy, and it was about giving this tool to Hollywood. Julian, so we had a big community campaign against it and eventually Google and Wikipedia and a bunch of others joined that campaign. But I didn't go, okay, that's great, we've won that battle. That scared the hell out of me, because Google suddenly saw itself as a political player and not just a distributor, and it felt that tremendous, enormous power over Congress. Jeremy, Google was just one bit of the anti-SOPA and PEPA coalition. Jacob, yes, but hang on, Tumblr, I think, made more of an impact than Google did. Andy, Tumblr and Wikipedia and tons of individual actions, very small actions you may never have heard of, made an impact. There were thousands of them being parallelized, going in the same direction, and that's, again, decentralized political action. It's a decentralized political movement that we have witnessed. Google may have been the biggest actor that you've noticed among the others. Julian: well, it's what Congress said that it noticed. Jacob: I take a little bit of an issue with what Jeremy said earlier because you essentially promote the idea of a political vanguard. I don't think you meant to do that, but you did, and I just wanted to stop you right there, because the peer-to-peer movement is explicitly against a political vanguard. It's the idea that we are all peers and we can share between each other. We may provide different services or we may provide different functionality. Once Ross Anderson said to me, when I joined the peer-to-peer movement 50 years ago, which I thought was a fantastic opener. He explained that he wanted to ensure that we never invented the printing press. Because as we start to centralize services, as we start to centralize control of information systems, we actually do start to invent the printing press in the sense that the Encyclopedia Britannica no longer prints books and they only print CDS. If you don't have a general-purpose computer that can read those CDS, you don't have access to that knowledge. Now, in the case of the Encyclopedia Britannica, it doesn't matter because we have Wikipedia and we have a lot of other material. But I don't think as a society that we're ready. I'm not sure Wikipedia is all that good compared as a resource. I don't trust a single page there that I didn't rewrite myself. Jacob: but the Encyclopedia Britannica is no different. It's just one source of many, and what matters is the verification of the data. All I mean to say is that we should not promote this idea of a vanguard because it is very dangerous. Julian: hang on, why? I'm a bit of a vanguard. What's the problem with them? Jeremy: I'm not talking about vanguards, I'm just saying that we have new tools between our hands. We were mentioning the printing press. Another visionary, a friend of mine, Benjamin Bayart, maybe less well known in the non-French speaking world, said, the printing press taught the people how to read, the internet taught the people how to write. This is something very new. This is a new ability for everyone to be able to write and express themselves. Yes, but filtering is becoming even more important these days. Jeremy: sure, because everybody talks, and many people say bullshit. As the academic and activist Larry Lessig and, I guess, so many other teachers will tell you, we teach people how to write, but when students give in their papers, 99% of them are crap, but nevertheless we teach them how to write. And so, of course, people say bullshit on the internet, that's obvious. But to be able to use this ability to express yourself in public makes you more and more constructed in your way of speaking over time, more and more able to participate in complex discussions. And all the phenomena we're describing are built around engineered complexity that we need to break down into small parts in order to be able to understand and debate calmly. It's not about a political vanguard, it's about channeling through the political system this new ability to express ourselves that we all have between our hands, to share our thoughts, to participate in the sharing of knowledge without being a member of a political party, of a media company, or of whatever centralized structure you needed in the past in order to be able to express yourself. Chapter 9. The Internet and Economics. Julian: I want to look at 3 basic freedoms. When I interviewed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Jacob: where's that fucking drone strike? What's that up there? Julian: well, he has his own kind of house arrest as well because he can't leave his secret location. Jacob: I'm not sure that I would make that comparison. Please don't make that comparison. Julian: there's a question whether Hezbollah has the ingredients of a state. Has it actually become a state? This is something that is mentioned in the US Embassy cables, that Hezbollah has developed its own fiber optic network in South Lebanon. So, it has the 3 primary ingredients of a state. It has control over armed force within a particular region, it has a communications infrastructure that it has control over, and it has a financial infrastructure that it has control over. And we can also think about this as 3 basic liberties. The liberty of freedom of movement, physical freedom of movement, your ability to travel from one place to another, to not have armed force deployed against you. We can think about the liberty of freedom of thought, and freedom of communication, which is inherently wrapped up in freedom of thought. If there's a threat against you for speaking publicly, the only way to safeguard your right to communicate is to communicate privately. And finally, the freedom of economic interaction, which is also coupled, like the freedom of communication, to the privacy of economic interaction. So let's speak about these ideas that have been brewing in the cypherpunks since the 1990s of trying to provide this very important third freedom, which is the freedom of economic interaction. Jeremy, but why would you need only 3 freedoms? In my European Charter for Fundamental Rights there are more. Julian, privacy becomes important either from a communitarian perspective, which is you need privacy in order to communicate freely and to think freely, or you need it for your economic interaction in some way. So I think there are more derivative freedoms, but these, the first 3 that I said, are the fundamental freedoms from which other freedoms derive. Jeremy, well, there is a legal definition to fundamental freedom. Julian, but I've read the EU Charter and I can tell you that it's an absolute dog's breakfast of consensus. Jeremy, yes, okay, and the lobbies managed to put intellectual property in the EU Charter. Julian, all sorts of crazy things. And I do think there is a point that we can agree on, which is that the money system, the economic infrastructure to interchange money, totally sucks at the moment. And even anybody who just has an eBay account will wildly agree with that, because what PayPal is doing, what Visa and MasterCard are doing, is actually putting people in a de facto monopoly situation. There was this very interesting thing from the WikiLeaks cables also, that said that the Russian government tried to negotiate a way that Visa and MasterCard payments from Russian citizens within Russia would have to be processed in Russia, and Visa and MasterCard actually refused it. Julian, yes, the power of the US Embassy and Visa combined was enough to prevent even Russia from coming up with its own domestic payment card system within Russia. ANDY, meaning that even payments from Russian citizens within Russian-to-Russian shops will be processed through American data centers. So the US government will have jurisdictional control, or at least insight. Julian, yes, so when Putin goes out to buy a Coke, 30 seconds later it is known in Washington, D.C. ANDY, and that, of course, is a very unsatisfying situation, independent of whether I like the US or not. This is just a very dangerous thing to have a central place where all payments are stored, because it invites all kinds of usage of that data. Jacob, one of the fundamental things the cypherpunks recognized is that the architecture actually defines the political situation, so if you have a centralized architecture, even if the best people in the world are in control of it, it attracts assholes, and those assholes do things with their power that the original designers would not do. And it's important to know that that goes for money. Julian, like oil wells in Saudi Arabia as well, the curse of oil. Jacob, no matter where we look we can see, especially with financial systems, that effectively even if the people have the best of intentions, it doesn't matter. The architecture is the truth. It's the truth of the internet with regard to communications. The so-called lawful intercept systems, which is just a nice way of saying spying on people. Julian, it's a euphemism, lawful interception. Jacob, absolutely, like lawful murder. ANDY, or lawful torture. Jacob, you've heard about the lawful drone strikes on American citizens by the US President, Obama? When he killed Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son in Yemen, that was lawful murder, or targeted killing as they put it. So-called lawful intercept is the same thing, you just put lawful in front of everything and then all of a sudden because the state does it, it is legitimate. But in fact it's the architecture of the state that allows them to do that at all, it's the architecture of the laws and the architecture of the technology, just as it's the architecture of financial systems. What the cypherpunks wanted to do was to create systems that allow us to compensate each other in a truly free way where it is not possible to interfere. Like Chaumian currencies, which are electronic currencies designed according to the specifications of David Chaum, the originator of eCash, a fully anonymous electronic currency, although you could argue that they are more centralized than is necessary. The idea is to be able to create anonymous currencies, as opposed to Visa MasterCard, which is a tracking currency. While built around a central authority, Chaumian currencies use cryptographic protocols invented by David Chaum in order to ensure anonymous transactions. Julian, so, basically electronic cash but without, say, serial numbers on the cash. Jacob, or serial numbers that allow you to establish that it is valid currency but don't allow you to know that Julian paid Andy, or what the amount was necessarily. Jeremy, it's recreating cash in the digital world, actually. Julian, creating an electronic currency is a big deal precisely because control over the medium of exchange is one of the 3 ingredients of a state, as I was saying with regard to Hezbollah. If you take away the state's monopoly over the means of economic interaction, then you take away one of the three principal ingredients of the state. In the model of the state as a mafia, where the state is a protection racket, the state shakes people down for money in every possible way. Controlling currency flows is important for revenue raising by the state, but it is also important for simply controlling what people do, incentivizing one thing, disincentivizing another thing, completely banning a certain activity, or an organization, or interactions between organizations. So, for example, with the extraordinary financial blockade against WikiLeaks, it's not the free market that has decided to blockade WikiLeaks, because it's not a free market. Government regulation has made particular financial players kings and doesn't allow other market entrants. Economic freedom has been impinged by an elite group that is able to influence both regulation and the principles involved in these banks. Sad to say, this is the unsolved problem of the electronic world right now. Two credit companies, both with a US-based electronic infrastructure for clearance, meaning access to the data in the US jurisdiction, control most of the credit card payments of the planet. Companies like PayPal, which is also governed under US jurisdiction, apply US policies, be it blocking the sale of Cuban cigars from German online retailers or the blockade of payments to WikiLeaks in non-US jurisdictions. This means the US government has access to data and the option to impose payment controls on worldwide payments. While American citizens might argue that this is the best democracy money can buy, for European citizens this is just priceless. Julian, in our traditional world we have had to a degree freedom of movement, not so great in some cases. Jacob, are you sure, Julian? I feel like your freedom of movement is a classic example of how free we really are. Julian, well no, the UK has announced it's going to put 100,000 people per year in my condition. So I think that is collateral to a degree. Jacob, this is the reason why the founders of my country shot people from Britain. There's a reason we shot the British. And it still exists today. The tyranny exists. Jeremy, let's not get personal. What your country, the US, is currently doing is privatizing prisons and negotiating contracts that guarantee a 90% filling rate to the private companies running these former US government prisons. Well, what is that? That is capitalism as absurd as it can get. Julian, there are more people in US prisons than there were in the Soviet Union. Jacob, this is this fallacy where, because I object to something that is wrong, you can suggest that I am part of something that is equally wrong. I'm not suggesting that the United States is perfect. I think the United States is actually pretty great in a lot of ways, but specifically with regard to the Founding Fathers' rhetoric. Julian, the Founding Fathers' rhetoric is in clear dissolution in the past 10 years. Jacob, we must not forget that a lot of perception about the Founding Fathers' rhetoric is mythology and we should be cautious about idolizing them. So, yes, of course. All I mean to say by my comment about British tyranny and the situation that Julian finds himself in is that this is actually a cultural thing. This is where society comes in and where society is very important, and it's very difficult for the technology to supplant that. And financial issues are the most dangerous thing to be working on. There is a reason why the person that created another electronic currency, Bitcoin, did so anonymously. You do not want to be the person that invents the first really successful electronic currency. Julian, the guys who did e-gold ended up being prosecuted in the US. Jacob, it's so incredibly frustrating. Julian, I want to go back to these three fundamental freedoms: freedom of communication, freedom of movement, and freedom of economic interaction. If we look at the transition of our global society onto the internet, when we made that transition, the freedom of personal movement is unchanged essentially. The freedom of communication is enhanced tremendously in some ways, in that we can now communicate to many more people. On the other hand, it is also tremendously degraded because there is no privacy anymore, and so our communications can be spied on, and are spied on and stored and, as a result, can be used against us. And so that elementary interaction that we have with people physically is degraded. Privacy is available, but it comes at a cost. Julian, our economic interactions have suffered precisely the same consequences. So in a traditional economic interaction, who knows about it? The people who saw you go down to the market. Now, who knows about your economic interaction? If you buy something from your next-door neighbor with your Visa card, which you could have done in a traditional market society almost completely privately, who knows about it now? Jacob: everybody. Julian: everybody knows. They have the data sharing between all the major Western powers, they all know about it and they store it forever. And why? Julian: it's not wrong what you're saying, but I'm not sure you can really distinguish between the freedom of communication and the freedom of economic interaction, because the internet as we have it today is the infrastructure for our social, our economic, our cultural, our political, all our interactions. Jacob: certainly the freedom of movement. NDY: whatever the communication architecture is, the money is just bits. This is just a usage of the internet. So if the economic system is based on the electronic infrastructure, the architecture of the electronic infrastructure says something about how the money flow is going, how it is being controlled, how it is being centralized and so on. The internet was perhaps not even thought to be the infrastructure for everything in the first days, but the economic logic said, well, it's cheaper to do that with the internet. The banks and credit card companies previously had ATM machines out there with X.25 interfaces, which was a separate network 10 or 20 years ago, and now it's all TCP/IP because it is cheaper. So the architecture of the technology is becoming a key issue because it affects all the other areas, and that's what we need to actually rethink, meaning that if we want a decentralized economic way of handling our payments, we need to take the infrastructure in our hands. Jacob: Bitcoin is essentially an electronic currency. ANDY, with no inflation. Jacob: it tends to do it in a decentralized manner, so instead of having the Federal Reserve you have a bunch of people all across the world that together agree on what reality is, and what their current currency is. Julian: and there are some computer programs that help facilitate this. Jacob: I want to explain it in a non-technical manner. It's an electronic currency which is more like a commodity than a currency in that people do determine how many euros it is to 1 Bitcoin. So it's a little bit like gold in this regard, and there's a cost of the so-called mining of the Bitcoins, where you do a search on a computer to find a Bitcoin, and the idea is that there's this computational complexity and it's tied to the value of the thing. So in non-technical terms it's a way for me to send Julian currency and for Julian to confirm it without Andy really being able to interfere or to stop it. There are some problems, though. It's not actually an anonymous currency, and this is a really bad thing in my opinion. Julian: Bitcoin is a very interesting hybrid, as the account holders are completely private and you can create an account at will, but the transactions for the entire Bitcoin economy are completely public. And that is how it works. It needs to be that way in order for everyone to agree that a transaction has occurred, that the sending account now has less money and the destination that much more. That's one of the few ways to run a distributed currency system that doesn't require a central server, which would be an attractive target for coercive control. It is the distribution that is really innovative in Bitcoin, and the algorithms that permit that distribution, where you do not trust any particular part of, if you like, the Bitcoin banking network. Rather, the trust is distributed. And enforcement is not done through law or regulation or auditing. It is done through the cryptographic computational difficulty that each part of the network has to go through to prove that it is doing what it claims. So the enforcement of honest Bitcoin banking is built into the architecture of the system. Computation translates into electricity costs for each branch of the Bitcoin bank, so we can assign a cost to commit fraud, in terms of electricity prices. The work needed to commit a fraud is set to be higher in electricity costs than the economic benefit derived from it. It is very innovative, not because these ideas haven't been explored before, they have been for over 20 years on paper, but because Bitcoin got the balance almost right and added one very innovative idea about how to prove a true global consensus about transactions of the Bitcoin economy, even assuming that many banks were fraudulent and that anyone could start one. Of course, just like every other currency, you have to buy the currency with something else. With work, or Bitcoins are traded for another currency. There are foreign exchange groups that do that. There are some other limitations. It has about a 10-minute settlement time. It takes about 10 minutes of computational work between handing over currency and the other party being sure that there is a global consensus that the transaction has taken place. It is exactly like cash, so it has all the theft problems that cash has. It has all the benefits as well. Once you've got it, you're sure that you have been paid, the check can't be cancelled, the bank can't retract it. Coercive force relations cut their ties. On the other hand, You have to guard cache well. That is, I think, its biggest problem. But it is quite easy to build additional layers on top, to build escrow services where you store your bitcoins in a service that is specifically designed to keep them safe and add insurance against theft. Jacob, interestingly, if the people that created Bitcoin had made it mandatory to use Tor, so you don't create an account, you create some cryptographic identifiers, it would have been possible if everything went over Tor as a core design that you did have location anonymity, even if you had long-term identifiers that identified you so you could link your transactions together. Jeremy, without entering into the technical considerations, we could agree that Bitcoin has excellent concepts but some flaws. It has a deflationist nature, because money tends to disappear from Bitcoin. So it cannot work in the long run, but it sets concepts that can be improved. It is maybe version 0.7 or 0.8 now. Jacob, this is like David Chaum reinvented. NY, Bitcoin was the most successful attempt to introduce a digital currency for the last 10 years, I would say. Julian, they got the balance almost right. I think Bitcoin will continue. It's an efficient currency, you can start up an account in 10 seconds, and to transfer money there is no overhead other than the cost of an internet connection and a few minutes of electricity. It's highly competitive compared to almost any other form of currency transfer. I think it will prosper. Look at what happened following several Bitcoin thefts and negative follow-up press in the summer of 2011 that drove the exchange rate down to $3 US. Bitcoin has gradually risen back up to $12. It hasn't climbed up or bounced back suddenly. It has climbed up in a gradual curve that seems to show a broad demand for the currency. I suspect a lot of the demand is petty drug trading, mail-order marijuana and so on. But Bitcoin has low overheads as a currency. Several ISPs, especially in places that can't get easy credit card services, like the former Soviet Union, are starting to use it. There will be a crackdown if it continues to grow. That will not get rid of Bitcoin, because cryptography prevents any simple attack via coercive force from working, but the sort of foreign exchange services that convert to and from Bitcoin could be targeted much more easily. On the other hand, these exchanges can run anywhere in the world, so there are quite a few jurisdictions one has to work through before there are no more exchanges, and then the black market has its own exchange logic. I think the play that needs to be conducted with Bitcoin is to get it adopted by the ISP and internet service industry for these little games you buy on Facebook and so on, because it is so efficient, and once it is well adopted by a variety of industries they will form a lobby to stop it being banned. That's a bit like how cryptography was adopted. It used to be classified as arms trading, and some of us as arms traders, but once it was in browsers and used for banking there was a powerful enough lobby to prevent it from being banned, although I concede there are moves afoot again. Jacob, the problem is that the privacy concerns are wrong. Let's be honest here. It's wrong to suggest that the economics of the situation are different with the internet than without the internet. When I came here and I bought British pounds I had to give up my social security number, which is my unique identifier in the United States. I had to give up my name, I had to link it to a bank account, I had to give them the money. They recorded all the serial numbers and then they took all that information and they reported that to the federal government. So, that's the analog. It's actually harder to get foreign currencies in the US because we're so far away from everywhere else. But there's a historical trend of control with regard to currency, and it's not just in regard to the internet that we see this control. In fact, there are to my understanding ATM machines in banks that record the serial numbers of cash and then track them to do flow analyses on the cash to see where it has been spent and who has done stuff with it. If we look at those systems and then we look at the internet, they did not improve the privacy as we migrated to the internet. In fact, they kept it as bad as it was to begin with. In this way, I think it's very important to then look at the trends from the world before the internet to see where we're headed. What we find is that if you have a lot of money you can pay a premium to keep your privacy, and if you don't have a lot of money you almost certainly have no privacy. And it's worse with the internet. Something like Bitcoin is a step in the right direction because when combined with an anonymous communications channel, like Tor for example, it allows you to actually send WikiLeaks a Bitcoin over Tor, and anyone watching this transaction would see a Tor user sending a Bitcoin and you receiving it. It's possible to do it, that is much better in some ways than cash. Julian, we all speak about the privacy of communication and the right to publish. That's something that's quite easy to understand. It has a long history and, in fact, journalists love to talk about it because they're protecting their own interests. But if we compare that value to the value of the privacy and freedom of economic interaction, actually every time the CIA sees an economic interaction they can see that it's this party from this location to this party in this location, and they have a figure to the value and importance of the interaction. So isn't the freedom, or privacy, of economic interactions actually more important than the freedom of speech, because economic interactions really underpin the whole structure of society? Jacob, they're inherently linked. I think you can tell the difference between the American and European cypherpunks right here because most of the American cypherpunks would say that they are exactly the same. Because in a society which has a free market one would argue that you put your money where your mouth is. Julian, where you put your money is where you put your power. Jacob, exactly. I'm not saying that that is right, that's almost a right attitude towards this, which maybe is not what we want. Maybe we want a socially constrained capitalism, for example. Julian, if we just look from a simple intelligence perspective, you've got a $10 million intelligence budget. You can spy on people's email interactions or you can have total surveillance of their economic interactions. Which one would you prefer? And why? Well, these days they will say, okay, we'll just force the payment companies and banks to use the internet, so we have both. And that's what they did. So the point is indeed that there is no direct escape here. You can do things like use Tor to protect your communication, you can encrypt your phone calls, you can do secure messaging. With money, it's a lot more complicated and we have these things called money laundering laws and so on, and they tell us that drug and terrorist organizations are abusing the infrastructure to do evil things. Jacob, it's the horsemen of the infopocalypse. And why? Actually, I'd be very interested to have more transparency on surveillance companies and government spending on these issues. The question is, what do we buy when we provide total anonymity of only the money system? What would actually happen? I think this might lead here and there to interesting areas where people may get themselves a little more easy and say, well, I can raise my voice, I can go to the parliament, but I can also just buy some politicians. Jeremy, you're describing the US, right? Jacob, it's not anonymous. And I'm not sure this is limited to the US. In Germany we don't actually call it corruption, we call it foundations that buy paintings painted by wives of politicians, and so it's in the art trade or other areas. So we have better names for it. Maybe in France you call it friendship parties and others call it hiring prostitutes. Jeremy, in the US it's particular because the link between the political system and money is so tight. Larry Lessig said, after 10 years of working on copyright issues, that he gave up on trying to fix copyright. He didn't really give up, because he found out that the problem wasn't politicians' understanding of what a good copyright policy would be. The problem was that there were just too many links to the industrial actors that were pushing for a bad copyright regime. So there is a real problem here. Julian, are you sure it's a problem, Jeremy? Maybe in fact it is a good attribute that those industries that are productive. And I think the devil's advocate is drinking my whiskey. Jacob, let's see if he can actually finish this sentence without cracking up. Troll us, Master Troll. Julian, those industries that are productive, that produce wealth for the whole society, use a portion of their money in order to make sure that they continue to be productive, by knocking out random legislation that comes out of political myth-making seeded by hype. And the best way to do that is, in fact, to buy congressmen, to take the labor of their productive industry and use it to modify the law so as to keep the productive nature of the industry going. Jacob, wait, I'll get this one. Ready? Ready? Right now, ready? No. Julian, why? Jacob, there are a couple of reasons, but for one, there is a feedback loop that is extremely negative. For example, I believe one of the largest political campaign donors in the state of California is the Prison Guard Union, and part of the reason for this is because they like to lobby for stronger laws, not because they care about the rule of law but because there is a job incentive. So, if you see that these people are lobbying to create more prisons, to jail more people, to have longer sentences, what is it they are effectively doing? What they're doing is they're using the benefit that they receive for the labor that was actually beneficial, arguably, in order to expand the monopoly that the state grants to them. Julian, so they're just using it for wealth transfer from actual productive industries to industries that are not productive? Jacob, you could sum it up that way. Julian, but maybe that's just a small component. Every system is abused. Perhaps these free riders that are just involved in wealth transfer are a small element, and in fact the majority of the lobbying, the majority of the influence on Congress does actually come from productive industries making sure that the laws continue to permit those industries to be productive. Jacob, but you can measure that very easily because you can look to see which people wish to promote rent-seeking activities, and wish to restrict the freedoms of other people to create a situation in which they themselves could not have risen to be where they are today. When they do those things, then you know that something has gone wrong and they're just protecting what they have, which they've essentially created through an exploitation, usually by an appeal to emotion where they say, gosh, stop the terrorist, stop the child pornography, stop the money laundering, fight the war on drugs. Maybe those things are all totally reasonable in the context in which they're originally presented, and usually they are, because generally speaking we think that those are bad because there is a serious component in each one of them. I'd like to get back to copyright and give you another example. There were serious issues when cars came out. Those who ran companies transporting passengers with horses feared that this would kill their business, which was true, but maybe it also made sense. I was invited to speak to the German Movie Companies Association, and before my speech there was a professor from a university in Berlin who spoke super politely about the evolution of the human race and the development of culture, saying that copying thoughts and processing them further on is the key thing, just as making movies is about taking themes and expressing them in a dramaturgic way. After his 40 minutes, the moderator brashly interrupted him and said, "Okay, so after you just said that we should legalize theft, let's see what the guy from the Chaos Computer Club has to say." And I was thinking, wow, what the fuck? If I'm going to speak out, will they let me out of here alive? So some industries just have business cases that are not serving evolution. This is selfish, staying on their de-evolutionary drive, making it even more monopolistic. When cassettes came out, they also thought that the record industry was going to die. The opposite happened, the record industry exploded. The question is, what's the policy here? What's the positive way we could formulate these things? Julian, I just wonder whether we couldn't, in fact, standardize the actual practice in the United States, and formalize it so you do simply by senators and by votes in the Senate. Jeremy, no. Andy, let's assume we have the money. Julian, yes, and that it is all open and there are buyers and each one goes to an auction. Andy, but the weapons industry would still have more money. Julian, no, I think it wouldn't. I actually think the military-industrial complex would be relatively marginalized because their ability to operate behind closed doors in a system that is not open to general market bidding is in fact higher than other industries. Jacob, there's a fundamental inequality in the system. Jeremy, from an economic liberal, anti-monopolistic perspective, when you say let's let the dominant actors decide what the policy will be, I can answer you with the experience of the internet in the last 15 years, where innovation was so-called bottom-up, where new practices emerged out of nothing, where a couple of guys in a garage invented a technology that spread. Julian, for nearly everything, for Apple, for Google, for YouTube, for everything. Jeremy, for everything. Everything that happened on the internet just boomed after being unknown a few months or a few years before, so you cannot predict what the next innovation will be, and the pace of innovation is so fast that it is much faster than the policymaking process. So when you design a law that has an impact on what the market is today, on what the strength relationship between various companies and actors is, if you strengthen one that is strong already, you may stop a new entrant from appearing that would have been more efficient. Julian, the market has got to be regulated to be free. Jeremy, of course you have to fight monopolies and you need to have a power that is superior to the power of those companies in order to punish bad behavior, but my point here is that policy has to adapt to society, and not the other way around. We have the impression with the copyright wars that the legislator tries to make the whole of society change to adapt to a framework that is defined by Hollywood, say. Okay, what you're doing with your new cultural practice is just morally wrong, so if you don't want to stop it, then we'll design legal tools to make you stop doing what you think is good. This is not the way to make good policy. A good policy looks at the world and adapts to it in order to correct what is wrong and to enable what is good. I'm convinced that when you enable the most powerful industrial actors to decide what policy should be, you don't go that way. Andy, I'm just trying to positively get us into thinking what would be a good policy. What you just formulated is at this stage, for me, a little too complicated. I'm trying to simplify a little bit. There is this guy called Heinz von Foster, the godfather of cybernetics, who once made a set of rules, and one of the rules was, always act in a way that increases the options. So with policies, technology, whatever, always do what gives you more, not less options. Julian, chess strategy as well. And why? It was mentioned that the increase of privacy on money transactions might have a negative effect, so we need to think, the money system right now has a specific logic, and the question is, how do we exclude the money system from taking over other areas? Because the money system has the ability, unlike the communication sector, to affect and totally limit the options of people in other areas. If you can hire contract killers to do specific things, or if you can buy weapons and engage in a war with other countries, then you're limiting other people's option to live, to act. If I put more money in communications, then more people have more options. If I put more weapons on the market. Jacob, no, the more you have the ability to surveil, the more you have control. ANDY, which is another good argument for restricting the weapons market, including telecommunication surveillance technology. Jacob, sure, you want to restrict my ability to sell that. How do you do that? How do you restrict my ability to transfer wealth, also through communications networks? One of the most offensive things about the bailouts in the United States, which were offensive for a whole bunch of reasons to many people, was that they showed that wealth is just a series of bits in a computer system. Some people, by begging in a very effective way, managed to get many of the bits to be set high, and then what is the question? Is there value in the system if you can just cheat the system and get your bits set high? And everybody else who is struggling to get along isn't acknowledged as even having bits that are worth flipping in the first place. NDY, so what you're saying is we need a totally different economic system? Because value today is not attached to economic value. Jacob, no, I'm saying there is an economic value. NDY, you can do bad things and generate money with it, and you can generate good things and you will not get a cent. Jacob, well no, what I'm saying is you can't decouple the economy from communication. I'm not talking about whether or not we need a different economic system. I'm not an economist. I'm just going to say that there is some value in the communication systems and in the freedom of those communications. Just as there is value in the freedom of actual bartering, I have the right to give you something in exchange for your labor, just as I have the right to explain an idea and you have the right to tell me what you think of my idea. We can't say that the economic system exists in some kind of vacuum. The communication system is directly tied together with this, and this is part of society. If we are going to have this reductionist notion of freedom, of the three freedoms Julian mentioned, this is obviously tied to freedom of movement. You cannot even buy a plane ticket now without using a trackable currency, otherwise you're flagged. If you walk into an airport and you try to buy a ticket on the same day with cash, you're flagged. You get extra security searches, you cannot fly without identification, and if you were to be so unlucky as to buy your plane ticket with a credit card, they'll log everything about you, from your IP address to your browser. I actually have the Freedom of Information Act data for my immigration and customs enforcement records from a couple of years ago, because I thought someday maybe it would be interesting to look at the differences. And sure enough, it has Roger Dingledine, who bought me a plane ticket for some work thing, his credit card, his address where he was when he bought it, the browser that he used, and everything about that plane ticket was all put together. Julian, and that went to the US government, it wasn't just kept in the commercial processor? Jacob, right. The commercial data was collected, sent to the government, and they were tied together. And the thing that I find to be really crazy is that it's essentially the merging of these three things you're talking about. It was my right to travel freely, it was my ability to buy that plane ticket or for someone else to purchase that plane ticket, and it was the ability for me effectively to be able to speak. I was going to travel to speak somewhere, and in order to do that I had to make compromises in the other two spheres. And in fact it impacts my ability to speak, especially when I find out later what they have collected and that they've put it together. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Chapter 10. Censorship. Julian. Jake, can you speak a little bit about the detainment that you've had at US airports, and why that has occurred? Jacob, they've asserted that it occurs because I know why. Julian, but they don't say? And can I try to summarize it? because technical security and the security of governmental affairs are two things that are totally detached. You can have a totally secure technical system and the government will think it's no good, because they think security is when they can look into it, when they can control it, when they can breach the technical security. This was not about Jake trying to approach planes, to kill anybody, to hijack the plane or whatever. This was about his ability to affect governmental affairs by traveling to other countries, speaking to people, and spreading ideas. That is the most dangerous thing that happens to governments these days, when people have better ideas than what their policy is. Jacob, I totally appreciate you complimenting me there in that statement, but I would just like to point out that this is way worse than that, because this is the data they collect on everyone. This was before I did anything interesting at all, it was merely the fact that I was traveling and the systems themselves, the architecture, promoted this information collection. This is before I was ever stopped for anything, it was before I was deported from Lebanon, it was before the US government took a special interest in me. ANDY, maybe they forecast it, maybe they saw it earlier than you did. Jacob, of course they did, partially because of collecting this data. But they always give me different answers. Usually they say one response, which is, uniformly across the board, because we can. And I say, okay, I do not dispute your authority. Well, I do dispute your authority. I do not dispute it now, I merely wish to know why this is happening to me. Now people tell me all the time, well, isn't it obvious? You work on tour, or, you're sitting next to Julian, what did you expect? It's fascinating to me because each of the different people that are holding me, usually from the Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States, will tell me it is because they have the authority to do so more than anything else. I've also had them tell me bullshit like, oh, remember 9/11? That's why, or, because we want you to answer some questions and this is the place you have the least amount of rights, or so we assert. And in this situation they'll deny access to a lawyer, they'll deny access to a bathroom but they'll give you water, they will give you something to drink, like a diuretic, in order to convince you that you really want to cooperate in some way. They did this to pressure, for political reasons. They asked me questions about how I feel about the Iraq War, how I feel about the Afghan War. Basically, every step of the way they repeated the tactics of the FBI during CENSORSHIP, the massive domestic covert operations program that ran between 1956 and 1971. For example, they specifically tried to assert their authority to change political realities in my own life, and to try to pressure me not only to change them, but to give them some special access to what's going on in my head. And they've seized my property. I'm not really at liberty to discuss all of the things that have occurred to me because it's a very murky grey area where I don't really know whether or not I'm even allowed to talk about them. I'm sure this happened to other people but I've never heard of it happening to them. I was in the Toronto Pearson Airport once while traveling home from an event where I was visiting my family. I was traveling back to Seattle, where I was living at the time, and they detained me, they put me in the secondary screening, and then the tertiary screening, and then finally into a holding cell. And they held me for so long that when I was finally released I missed my flight. But there's a curious thing, which is that these pre-detention areas are actually technically US soil on Canadian soil, and so they have a rule that says that if you miss your flight or it's so long before the next flight, you have to leave. So I technically got kicked out of America by being detained so long and I had to enter Canada, fly across the country, rent a car, and then drive across the border. And when I got to the border they said, "How long have you been in Canada?" And I said, well, 5 hours plus the detainment that happened in Toronto, so I had been in Canada about 8 hours, and they said, well, come on in, we're going to detain you again. And then they ripped my car apart and they took my computer apart and they looked through all this stuff, and then they held me. They gave me access to a bathroom within half an hour, they were very merciful you could say. And this is what they call the border search exception. This kind of behavior is because they have the ability, they assert, to do this, and no one challenges them about it. Julian. So, this has happened to you, but Chinese people I speak to, when they speak about the Great Firewall of China, in the West we talk about this in terms of censorship, that it's blocking Chinese citizens from coming out and reading what is said about the Chinese government in the West and by Chinese dissidents and by the Falun Gong and by the BBC and, to be fair, in actual propaganda about China, but their concern is actually not about censorship. Their concern is that in order to have internet censorship there must also be internet surveillance. In order to check what someone is looking at, to see whether it is permitted or denied, you must be seeing it, and therefore if you are seeing it you can record it all. And this has had a tremendous chilling effect on the Chinese, not that they're being censored but that everything that they read is being spied upon and recorded. In fact, that's true for all us. This is something that modifies people, when they are aware of it. It modifies their behavior and they become less resolute in complaining about various kinds of authorities. Jacob, that's the wrong answer to that type of influence, though. Their harassment of me at borders, for example, is not unique, in that every Arab American, since September 11th and before, has had to deal with this. It's just that I refuse to let the privilege of having white skin and a US passport go to waste in this, and I refuse to be silent about it because the things that they are doing are wrong, and the power that they are using, they are abusing. And we must stand up to those things, just in the same way that there are brave people in China that stand up to this, like Isaac Mao for example. He has been working very strongly against this type of censorship effectively, because the right answer is not to just give in to this type of pressure merely because the government asserts that it has the ability to do this. Jeremy, but once again we're talking politics because what you say is, basically, that people should stand up for their rights, but people should understand why to do so, and then have the ability to communicate between each other to do so. I had the occasion to talk with some people from China, and I don't know if they were in some position in the state, or if they were selected in order to be able to go outside to talk to me, but when talking to them about internet censorship I very often had this answer: well, it's for the good of the people. There is censorship, yes, because if there wasn't censorship then there would be extremist behavior, there would be things that we would all dislike, and so the government is taking those measures in order to make sure that everything goes well. Jacob, that's the same argument for organ harvesting. Don't let those organs go to waste. Jeremy, if you look at the way Chinese censorship is being done, you see from the technical perspective that it's one of the most advanced systems that exists in the world. Jacob, absolutely. Jeremy, and I've heard that on Weibo, that is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, the government has the ability to filter some hashtags to make sure they don't leave a selected province. Jacob, it's crucial to remember that when people talk about censorship in Asia they like to talk about it in terms of the other, as if it only affects the people in over there Eastern. It's very important to know that when you search on Google in the United States, they say that they have omitted search results because of legal requirements. There is a difference between the two, both in how they are implemented and, of course, in the social reality of the how, the why, and the where even, but a big part of that actually is the architecture. For example, over the American internet, it's very decentralized, it's very hard to do the Chinese-style censorship in the same respect. Julian, well, a big chunk of it is Google and you can censor Google. There are a load of pages that reference WikiLeaks that are censored by Google. Jacob, yes, no doubt. And actually since the index itself is free, it's possible to do a differential analysis. Julian, yes, in theory. Jacob, in theory. And in practice there are some people that are working on that type of censorship detection by looking at the differences from different perspectives in the world. I think that it is important to remember that censorship and surveillance are not issues of other places. People in the West love to talk about how Iranians and the Chinese and North Koreans need anonymity and freedom, but we don't need it here. And by here, they usually mean in the United States. But actually it is not just oppressive regimes, because if you happen to be in the top echelon of any regime it's not oppressive to you. But we consider the UK to be a wonderful place. Generally people think Sweden is a pretty great place. And yet you can see that when you fall out of favor with the people in power you don't end up in a favorable position. But Julian's still alive, right? So clearly that's a symbol that it's a free country, is that right? Julian, I worked hard to maintain my current position. But maybe we should speak about internet censorship in the West. This is very interesting. If we go back to 1953 and we look at the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which was distributed everywhere, that encyclopedia sometimes had amendments as politics changed in the Soviet Union. In 1953 Beria, the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, died and fell out of political favor and so his section, which described him in glowing terms, was removed by the Encyclopedia Authority which posted out an amendment that was to be pasted into all of those encyclopedias. It was extremely obvious. I'm mentioning this example because it was so obvious and so detectable that the attempt became part of history. Whereas in the UK we have The Guardian and the other major newspapers ripping out stories from their internet archives in secret without any description. You go to those pages now and you try to find them, for example stories on the fraud case of the billionaire Nadmi Orchi, and you see, page not found, and they have also been removed from the indexes. Let me tell you my involvement with the Nadmi Orchi story. In 1990 Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that led to the First Gulf War. The Kuwaiti government in exile, and also during its return, needed cash, so it started to sell off various assets including several oil refineries outside Kuwait. A UK businessman, Nadmi Orchi, who had immigrated to the UK in the early 1980s from Iraq, where he used to be a figure in Saddam Hussein's regime, was a broker in that deal and was subsequently accused of being involved in channeling $118 million of illegal commissions. That investigation was the largest corruption investigation in European post-war history. In 2003 Orchi was convicted of fraud in what was to become known as the Elf Aquitaine scandal. Nevertheless, nowadays he has over 200 companies registered through his Luxembourg holding outfit, and others through Panama. He is involved in post-war Iraqi cellular contracts and many other businesses around the world. In the United States, Tony Resco, a fundraiser for Barack Obama's Senate campaign, was a long-term pal of Orchi's, who had been his financier. Similarly, Orchi and Resco became involved with the former governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich. Both Resco and Blagojevich were convicted of corruption, Resco in 2008 and Blagojevich in 2010-11, after the FBI recorded him in telephone intercept trying to sell Obama's former Senate seat. In 2007-8, when Obama was running to be the Democrats' presidential candidate, the U.S. press started to investigate Obama's connections. They investigated Resco and reported some links in relation to the purchase of Barack Obama's house. In 2008, shortly before his trial, Resco received a $3.5 million transfer from Orchi which he didn't report to the court, despite being required to, for which he was jailed. So U.S. press scrutiny turned to Orchi, and at that moment he instructed UK lawyers Carteruck to wage an aggressive campaign on much of the 2003 reportage about the Elf Aquitaine scandal and his conviction in France. This was very successful. He targeted the UK press, and even US blogs, and had nearly a dozen articles removed that we know about. Most of those articles, including in UK newspaper archives, simply disappeared. It was as if they had never even existed. There was no, "We have received a legal complaint and decided to remove the story." They also disappeared from the indexes. WikiLeaks dug these out and republished them. Jacob, they erase history. Julian, history is not only modified, it has ceased to have ever existed. It is Orwell's dictum, he who controls the present controls the past and he who controls the past controls the future. It is the undetectable erasure of history in the West, and that's just post-publication censorship. Pre-publication self-censorship is much more extreme but often hard to detect. We've seen that with Cablegate as WikiLeaks works with different media partners all over the world, so we can see which ones censor our material. For example, the New York Times redacted a cable that said that millions of dollars were distributed to covertly influence politically connected Libyans via oil companies operating in Libya. The cable didn't even name a specific oil company, the New York Times simply redacted the phrase oil services companies. Probably the most flagrant was the New York Times' use of a 62-page cable about North Korea's missile program, and whether they had sold missiles to the Iranians, from which the New York Times used 2 paragraphs in order to argue, in a story, that Iran had missiles that could strike Europe, whereas elsewhere in the cable just the opposite was argued. The Guardian redacted a cable about Yulia Tymoshenko, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, which said that she might be hiding her wealth in London. It censored out allegations that the Kazakhstani elite in general was corrupt, not even a named person, and an allegation that both Eni, the Italian energy company operating in Kazakhstan, and British Gas were corrupt. Essentially, The Guardian censored instances where a rich person was accused of something in a cable, unless The Guardian had an institutional agenda against that rich person. So, for example, in a cable about Bulgarian organized crime there was one Russian, and The Guardian it made it look like the whole thing was about him, but he was just one person on a long list of organizations and individuals associated with Bulgarian organized crime. Der Spiegel censored out a paragraph about what Merkel was doing, no human rights concern whatsoever, purely political concerns about Merkel. There are lots of examples. And why? Our understanding of freedom of information and the free flow of information is in some way a very radical new concept if you look at planet Earth. I would say it's not much different between Europe and other countries. Well, there are countries that have a democratic framework, which means you can read and understand and maybe even legally fight the censorship infrastructure, but it doesn't mean it's not there, while you will have a hard time trying in Saudi Arabia or China. Julian, my experience in the West is that it is just so much more sophisticated in the number of layers of indirection and obfuscation about what is actually happening. These layers are there to give deniability to the censorship that is occurring. You can think about censorship as a pyramid. This pyramid only has its tip sticking out of the sand, and that is by intention. The tip is public libel suits, murders of journalists, cameras being snatched by the military, and so on, publicly declared censorship. But that is the smallest component. Under the tip, the next layer is all those people who don't want to be at the tip, who engage in self-censorship to not end up there. Then the next layer is all the forms of economic inducement or patronage inducement that are given to people to write about one thing or another. The next layer down is raw economy, what it is economic to write about, even if you don't include the economic factors from higher up the pyramid. Then the next layer is the prejudice of readers who only have a certain level of education, so therefore on one hand they are easy to manipulate with false information, and on the other hand you can't even tell them something sophisticated that is true. The last layer is distribution. For example, some people just don't have access to information in a particular language. So that is the censorship pyramid. What The Guardian is doing with its Cablegate redactions is in the second layer. Now, such censorship is deniable because it either takes place out of the light, or because there is no instruction to censor a particular claim. Journalists are rarely instructed, don't print anything about that, or, don't print that fact. Rather they understand that they are expected to because they understand the interests of those they wish to placate or grow close to. If you behave you'll be patted on the head and rewarded, and if you don't behave then you won't. It's that simple. I'm often fond of making this example, the obvious censorship that occurred in the Soviet Union, the censorship that was propagandized about so much in the West, jackboots coming for journalists in the middle of the night to take them from their homes, has just been shifted by 12 hours. Now we wait for the day and take homes from journalists, as they fall out of patronage and are unable to service their debts. Journalists are taken from their homes by taking homes from the journalists. Western societies specialize in laundering censorship and structuring the affairs of the powerful such that any remaining public speech that gets through has a hard time affecting the true power relationships of a highly fiscalized society, because such relationships are hidden in layers of complexity and secrecy. ANDY, Jeremy mentioned the pedo-Nazis. Jacob, we're back to the pedo-Nazis again. Jeremy, two horsemen in one. And why? The pedo-Nazis pretty well summarized the German, or maybe part of the European censoring arguments. Germany didn't want any hate speech-like content on the internet due to its history and, of course, if you tell people you need to restrict the internet because of pedophiles then you will be able to do anything. Also, there was an internal working paper of the European Commission about data retention that argued, we should talk more about child pornography and then people will be in favor. Julian, can you speak to this a little bit? That if we are to censor just one thing, say just child pornography, then in order to censor child pornography from people seeing it we need to surveil everything that everyone is doing. We need to build that infrastructure. We need to build a bulk spying and censorship system to censor just one thing. ANDY, it's in the detail of the mechanics. The so-called pre-censorship system in Germany obliges you to name the legally responsible person for whatever you publish. So, roughly, if you publish something, be it on a piece of paper or on the internet, without saying who is legally responsible for the content, you already violate the law. This means that you allocate the responsibility, and if someone violates the law by distributing, let's say child porn or hate speech, you could just say, okay, we look at where that guy is located and we catch him and we get the stuff off of the net. Julian, that is we censor the publisher instead of censoring the reader. ANDY, yes. And this is watching specific things. I could agree that not everything needs to be available at all times, because if I look at hate speech issues, there are sometimes things with private addresses of people and so on that might lead to situations I'm not in favor of. Julian: but Andy, this is such a German thing. In order to do that, in order to determine what's going to be acceptable and what's not, you have to have a committee, you have to have appointments to that committee, you have to have a process of appointments to that committee. Andy: yes, we have all that bullshit. The German killings in the Second World War, everything the Nazis did, every property they seized, they gave a receipt, they made a list. It was all bureaucratic acts. You can say that Germans unjustifiably killed a lot of people, that's true, but they did it in a bureaucratic manner. That's Germany. Julian: if you have someone deciding what should be censored and what should not, then you have to have two things. First of all, you have to build a technical architecture to do the censorship. You have to build a nationwide censorship machine to do it effectively. And then secondly, you have to have a committee and a bureaucracy to censor. And that committee inherently has to be secret, because it's completely useless unless it is secret, and therefore you have secret justice. Andy: you know what? We have one good principle in Germany. Jacob: just the one? Andy: the principle is that if it is unrealistic for a law to be applied, then it shouldn't be there. If a law doesn't make sense, like if you forbid windmills or whatever, then we say, hey, come on, forget it. We here are inspired by the internet as we knew it when it was growing up, by the free flow of information, in the sense of free as in unlimited, as in not blocked, not censored, not filtered. So if we apply our understanding of the free flow of information to planet Earth, and it has been roughly applied to planet Earth, we see, of course, the governments being affected by it and the way power has been applied and the way censorship has been run, be it pre-censorship, post-censorship, or whatever censorship. We have all learned about these complicated conflicts that arise. The question is, what is our concept of government or the future of a post-governmental organization? Maybe WikiLeaks is the first or one of the first PGOs, because I'm not sure governments are the right answer to all the problems on this planet, like environmental issues. Julian: the governments are not sure either of the barrier between what is government or not. It's fuzzed out now. Governments occupy space, but WikiLeaks occupies part of the space of the internet. Internet space is embedded in real space, but the degree of complexity between the embedded object and the embedding means that it's not easy for the embedding to tell that the embedded object is even part of it. So that's why we have this sense of a cyberspace, that it is actually some other realm that exists somewhere. It's because of the degree of its indirection, complexity, and universality. When you read some file on the internet in one location, it's the same as reading it in another location or in the future. That's its universality. So to that degree, as an organization that occupies cyberspace and is adept at moving its information around the underlying embeddings, maybe we are a post-state organization because of the lack of geographic control. I don't want to take this analogy too far, because I am under house arrest. The coercive force of states obviously applies to all our people, wherever they are known. But the rest of the press likes to say we're a stateless media organization, and they are quite right about the importance of statelessness. I always used to say, well, what do you think News Corp is? It's a big multinational. But nonetheless, News Corp is structured in such a way that you can get at its key components, and that's why it has had so much trouble here in the UK with the phone hacking scandal, and why it is trying so hard to suck up to the US establishment. But if an organization's assets are primarily its information, then it can be transnational in a way that is quite hard to stop as a result of cryptography. There is a reason a financial blockade was erected against us. Our other organizational facets are harder to suppress. Jacob: if we're talking about it in utopian terms, we have to actually go back a little bit further. So, you asked me about the harassment I received, you asked about censorship in the West, and I talked earlier about Obama's targeted killing program, which they say is lawful because there is a process, therefore it counts as due process. Julian: well, a secret process. Jacob: we can also tie this back to John Gilmore. One of John Gilmore's lawsuits about his ability to travel anonymously in the United States resulted in the court literally saying, look, we're going to consult with the law, which is secret. We will read it and we will find out when we read this secret law whether or not you are allowed to do the thing that you are allowed to do. And they found when they read the secret law that, in fact, he was allowed to do it, because what the secret law said did not restrict him. He never learned what the secret law was at all, and later they changed the U.S. Transportation Security Administration and Department of Homeland Security policies in response to him winning his lawsuit, because it turns out the secret law was not restrictive enough in this way. Julian: so they made it more restrictive? Jacob: effectively, through enabling legislation of the bureaucracy. But it's important to note that the targeted assassination program, the harassment that people face at borders, the censorship that we find online, the censorship that corporations perform at the behest of a government or at the behest of a corporation, these things all tie back together. And what it really comes down to is that the state has too much power at each of the places that we see these things come out. This is because the power has concentrated in these areas and it has attracted people that abuse it, or that push for its use. And even if there are sometimes legitimate cases, what we see is that the world would be better off if there was not that centralization, if there was not the tendency towards authoritarianism. The West is not in any way special with regard to this, because it turns out that if you have a Tsar of cybersecurity, well, that's not so different from a Tsar that was in the internal security forces of another nation 50 years ago. We're building the same kind of authoritarian control structures, which will attract people to abuse them, and that's something that we try to pretend is different in the West. It's not different in the West because there's a continuum of governance, which is authoritarianism to libertarianism. I don't mean it in the American political party sense, but in this sense, on that continuum, the United States is very far from the USSR in many, many ways, but it's a lot closer to the USSR than Christiania is, the autonomous neighborhood in the heart of Copenhagen, in Denmark. And it is even further, I think, from a potential utopian world if we went and created a brand new colony on Mars. We would want to move what we might build on Mars as far away from totalitarianism and authoritarianism as we could. These are failings when we don't have that. Jeremy: once again, all those topics are bound together. When we talk about concentrating power, we once again talk about architecture. And when we talk about internet censorship, it is about centralizing the power to determine what people may be able to access or not, and whether government censorship or also private-owned censorship is undue power. We have this example. Our website laquadrature.net got censored in the UK by Orange UK for several weeks. It was among a list of websites that Orange was denying to those less than 18 years old. Maybe we mentioned the term child pornography while we were opposing that type of legislation, or maybe they just disliked us because we oppose their policy against net neutrality, as we advocate for a law to ban them from discriminating their users' communications. We will never know. But we have a private actor here that, as a service, was offering to remove from people the ability to access information on the internet. I see a major risk here beyond the power we give to either Orange or the government of China or whoever. Jacob: clarification, when you say private in the UK, do you mean that they actually own every line, every fiber connection and everything, or do they use some of the state's resources? How were the airwaves licensed? There's no state involvement at all? They have no duty of care. Jeremy: there is licensing. Whether it's government or company, they are changing the architecture of the internet from one universal network to a balkanization of small subnetworks. But what we are discussing since the beginning are all global issues, whether we're talking of the financial system going awry, whether we're talking of corruption, whether we're talking about geopolitics or energy or the environment. All of these are global problems that mankind is facing today, and we still have one global tool between our hands that enables better communication, better sharing of knowledge, better participation in political and democratic processes. What I suspect is that a global universal internet is the only tool we have to address those global issues, and that is why this fight for a free internet is the central fight that we all here have a responsibility to fight. And why? I totally agree that we need to ensure that the internet is understood as a universal network with free flow of information, that we need to not only define that very well, but also to name those companies and those service providers who provide something they call internet, which is actually something totally different. But I think we have not answered the key question beyond this filtering thing. I want to give you an example of what I think we need to answer. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, we protested against Siemens providing so-called smart filter software. Siemens is one of the biggest telcos in Germany and a provider of intelligence software. And they actually sold this filtering system to companies so that, for example, employees couldn't look at the site of the trade unions to inform themselves of their labor rights and so on. But they also blocked the Chaos Computer Club site, which made us upset. They designated it as criminal content or something, for which we brought legal action. But at an exhibition we decided to have a huge protest meeting and to surround Siemens booths and filter the people coming in and out. The funny thing was that we announced it on our site to attract as many people as possible through the internet, and the people in the Siemens booth had no fucking clue because they also used the filter software, so they couldn't read the warning that was obviously out there. Julian, the Pentagon set up a filtering system so that any email sent to the Pentagon with the word WikiLeaks in it would be filtered. And so in the case of Bradley Manning, the prosecution, in attempting to prosecute the case, of course, was mailing people outside the military about WikiLeaks, but they never saw the replies because they had the word WikiLeaks in them. The national security state may eat itself yet. NDY, which brings us back to the really basic question, is there something such as negative affecting information? So, from a society point of view, do we want a censored internet because it's better for society or not? And even if we talk about child pornography, you could argue, wait a moment, this child pornography highlights a problem, that is the abuse of children, and in order to solve the problem we need to know the problem. Jacob, so it provides evidence for the crime. Julian, well, no, it provides a lobby. And why? That would be the most radical approach, but if we talk about Nazis or whatever, you still have to say what we're talking about. People who have family will ask themselves, well, isn't it better for society to filter the bad things out so that we stick to the good things, or is that not limiting our ability to view the problems and manage them and handle them and take care of them? Jeremy, I think the solution is always another one than censorship. When we talk about child pornography, we shouldn't even use the word pornography, it is a representation of crime scenes of child abuse. One thing to do is to go to the servers, to disable the servers, to identify the people who uploaded the content in order to identify the people who produced the content, who abused the children in the first place. And whenever there is a network of people, a commercial network and so on, go and arrest the people. And when we pass laws, and we have one in France where you have an administrative authority from the Ministry of Interior that decides which websites will be blocked, we remove an incentive to the investigative services to go and find the people who do the bad stuff by saying, oh, we just remove the access to the bad stuff, like we put a hand in front of the eyes of someone looking at the problem, therefore we solved the problem. So, just from that perspective, I think it is enough to describe it like this, where we all agree that we should remove those images from the internet. Jacob, I'm sorry, I'm squirming over here. It's so frustrating to hear the argument that you're making. I want to throw up, because what you just did, is you said, I want to use my position of power to assert my authority over other people, I want to erase history. Maybe I'm an extremist in this case and in many other cases, I'm sure, but I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is actually an example of where erasing history does a disservice. It turns out that with the internet we learned that there's an epidemic in society of child abuse. That's what we learned with this child pornography issue. I think it's better to call it child exploitation. We saw evidence of this. Covering it up, erasing it, is, I think, a travesty because, in fact, you can learn so much about society as a whole. For example, you can learn, and I'm obviously never going to have a career in politics after I finish this sentence, but just to be clear about this, you learn, for example, who is producing it, and you learn about the people that are victimized. It is impossible for people to ignore the problem. It means that you have to start searching out the cause that creates this, which is the exploiters of the children. Ironically, some surveillance technology might be useful here in facial recognition of people and by looking at the metadata in the images. Erasing that, making sure that we live in a world where it's possible to erase some stuff and not other stuff, creating these administrative bodies for censorship and for policing, that's a slippery slope which, as we have seen, has turned directly to copyright, it has turned to many other systems. Just because it is a noble cause to go after that, maybe we should not take the easy way out, maybe in fact we should try to solve crimes, maybe in fact we should try to help those that are victimized, even though there is a cost to that kind of helping. Maybe instead of ignoring the problem, we should look at the fact that society as a whole has this big problem and it manifests on the internet in a particular way. It's like, for example, how when Polaroid built the Swinger camera, this instant camera for taking pictures, people started to take abusive pictures with those as well. But the answer is not to destroy a medium, or to police that medium. It is when you find evidence to prosecute the crimes that the medium has documented. It is not to weaken that medium, it is not to cripple society as a whole over this thing. Because here we talk about child pornographers, let's talk about the police. The police on a regular basis in many countries abuse people. There are probably more abusive cops on the internet than there are child pornographers on the internet. Julian, there are almost certainly more. Jacob, we know there's n number of policemen in the world, and we know there's X number of those policemen that have committed ethical violations, usually violent violations. If we look at just the Occupy movement, for example, we see this. Shall we censor the internet because we know some cops are bad? Shall we cripple the police's ability to do good policing work? Julian, well, there is a question about revictimization, which is where the child later on, or as an adult, or its social contacts, see the child abuse images again. Jacob, as long as those cops are online, I am being revictimized. Julian, you could say seeing an image of you being beaten by a policeman is revictimization. I would say that the protection of the integrity of the history of what actually happened in our world is more important. That revictimization does occur, but nonetheless to set up a censorship regime which is capable of removing chunks of history means that we cannot address the problem because we can't see what the problem is. In the 1990s I acted in an advisory capacity on internet matters to paedophile busting cops in Australia, the Victorian Child Exploitation Unit. Those cops were not happy about filtering systems, because when people can't see that there's child pornography on the internet, it removes the lobby that ensures that the cops have the funds to stop the abuse of children. Jeremy, the point on which we agree, I think it's the most important one, is that in the end it's the individual responsibility of the people who do the content, the child abuse material and things like that, that really matters and on which cops should work. Jacob, we don't agree. That's not what I said. Julian, no, Jeremy is talking about doing, not publishing, there's a difference. Jacob, the production of the content is not the issue, actually. Just a minor clarification: if, for example, you have abused a child and Andy took a picture of this as proof, I don't think Andy should be prosecuted. Jeremy, no, it's the people who abuse. Come on, it's aiding and abetting. NDY, but some people abuse the child to produce the pictures, right? Jacob, of course they do. NDY, there might also be an economic aspect involved here. Jacob, I agree with that entirely. I'm making a distinction here, which is to say that if the content itself is a historical record which is evidence of a crime, it is evidence of a very serious crime, and we should never lose sight of the fact that there is revictimization, but there is the original victimization, and that is actually the core issue, whether or not there are pictures of it. Jeremy, of course. That's what I mean. Jacob, whether or not there are pictures is almost irrelevant. When there are pictures, it is very important to remember that you have to keep your eye on the prize, and that the goal is to actually stop the harm, stop the abuse. A big part of that is making sure that there is evidence and that there is the incentive for the people with the right tools to solve those crimes. That, I think, is incredibly important, and people really lose sight of that because the easy thing to do is to pretend that it doesn't exist, and then to stop it and say that has stopped the abuse. And it hasn't. And why? And the trouble is that right now a lot of people will obviously favor the easy solution because it's very inconvenient to look at what's really going on in society. I think you do have a chance to handle a political problem because you're not trying to make a policy that ignores the problem or makes it invisible. In a way this may be cyberpolitics, but this is also a question of how a society handles issues, and I do have strong doubts that there is something such as information that does harm directly. It has to do with the ability to filter, of course, and it's also true that I don't want to see all the pictures that are available on the internet. There are some that I really find disgusting and distracting, but the same is true for the next video store, showing movies that are fictional and ugly. So, the question is, do I have the ability to handle what I'm seeing and what I'm processing and what I'm reading? And that is the filtering approach. Actually, War Holland, the founder of Chaos Computer Club, said something funny. You know, filtering should be handled in the end user, and in the end device of the end user. Julian, so filtering should be done by the people who receive information. ANDY, it should be done here. Here. Pointing to his head. Julian, in the brain. And why? In the end device of the end user, that's this thing you have between your ears. That's where you should filter, and it shouldn't be done by the government on behalf of the people. If the people don't want to see things, well, they don't have to, and you do have the requirement these days to filter a lot of things anyhow. Chapter 11. Privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Julian, Andy, I spoke recently with the president of Tunisia and I asked him about what was going to happen to the intelligence records from the rule of the dictator Ben Ali, the equivalent of the Stasi archives of Tunisia, and he said that while these were very interesting, the intelligence agencies are a problem, they are dangerous, and he would have to knock them off one by one. But in relation to these archives, he thought it best for the cohesion of Tunisian society that they all be kept secret so there wasn't a blame game. You were a young man during the fall of the Stasi in East Germany. Can you speak a little bit about the Stasi archives, and what do you think about this opening up of security archives? ANDY, Germany probably has the most well-documented intelligence agency on the planet, or one of them. All the documents from the East German Staatssicherheit, all the handbooks, procedural papers, training documents, internal studies, are roughly public. Roughly means that not all of them are easy to access, but a lot of them are, and the government has created an agency to take care of the records so German citizens also have the right to view their own Stasi files. Julian, the German government created the BSTU, the Bundesbeauftragte für die Stasi-Unterlagen, this big Stasi archives file distributor. NDY, yes, and journalists can apply so-called research inquiries, which is maybe comparable to freedom of information requests, to allow them to study matters. And there are lots of books, and also handbooks of strategic behavioral learning of how the Stasi applied this and that. Actually, I think this is a very good thing to learn from. I can understand it is a bit too much to expect the Tunisians to publish all the personal records that the former intelligence agency made because the current president, will have to judge about his own records here, and also those of his allies and so on. These intelligence agencies don't respect privacy, so you will have personal records of your sexual matters, your telecommunications, your money transfers, of everything you have done, which you might not want to have disclosed. Julian, did you follow the situation with the Amel Dawla in Egypt, the domestic state security? Thousands of people went in, they looted the archives as the Amel Dawla tried to burn them and destroy them and dump them in the garbage, and lots of material came out and was spread around the place. You could buy a record for $2 in a local market and upload it. It hasn't destroyed Egyptian society. And no, I'm just saying that I do have a bit of an understanding that people don't want their personal records to be released. I can understand that, if I was living in a country where 40 years of intelligence was kept about me and every time I go to the loo it is being recorded. Julian, but there's cost-benefit analysis, right? From my perspective, once a rat, always a rat. And right, but the hacker ethics argument, roughly, is to use public information and protect private information or data, and I do think that if we're advocating for privacy and we have very good reasons to do so, we shouldn't just say there's a balance of things here. We can distinguish. It's not that we have to put it all on the public. Jacob, but there's a benefit to that secrecy that is asymmetric. Let's take a step back. You argue essentially from a completely flawed point, which is this notion that data is private when it is limited, and that's just not true. For example, in my country, if 1 million people have a security clearance and are allowed to access that private data. Julian, 4.3 million. Jacob, how can you call that data private? The problem is that it is not truly 100% secret from every person on the planet. Julian, it's secret from the powerless and to the powerful. ANDY, yes, you're right. But if we want to open the archive entirely, Julian, it has happened in some European countries. ANDY, no. I don't know a single country where all the records have been disclosed. Julian, to a greater extent than Germany, records were released, in Poland for example. ANDY, that might be. What has happened actually, the bad side of this deal Germany has done, is that they used former officers of the East German state security in order for the Stasi to administer not only the Stasi records but also part of the so-called New Germany, the unified former eastern part. There's this interesting story about a company winning the public tender to clean the building where the records were kept. That company won the tender just because they were the cheapest bidder for the same service that other companies bid for. After 6 years, the organization keeping the records found out that they had hired a company built up by the former Eastern Intelligence to clean their own records. Jeremy, there was a report on that on WikiLeaks. I read it. It was great. Anyway, WikiLeaks published the report about exactly that. So you are right that once these records are created and they are in the hands of evil people, it is hard to declare privacy. Julian, we can go to a broader issue, though. The internet has led to an explosion of the amount of information that is available to the public. It's just extraordinary. The educative function is extraordinary. On the other hand, people talk about WikiLeaks and they say, look, all that private government information is now public. The government can't keep anything secret. I say this is rubbish. I say that WikiLeaks is the shadow of a shadow. In fact, that we have produced over 1 million words of information and given it to the public is a function of the enormous explosion in the amount of secret material out there. And, in fact, powerful groups have such a vast amount of secret material now that it dwarfs the amount of publicly available material, and the operations of WikiLeaks are just a percentage fraction of this privately held material. When you look at this balance between powerful insiders knowing every credit card transaction in the world on the one hand, and on the other hand people being able to Google and search for the blogs of the world and people's comments, how do you see this balance? And why? I could argue that it is good if all these records get disclosed because people will learn that if they use their credit card they leave a trace. Some people, if we explain it to them, will find this very hard to understand and very abstract. The moment they read their own records they will understand. Julian, if you get your Facebook record, which has 800 megabytes of information about you. And I know that after the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl wanted to unify Germany and the Americans made a condition within the so-called 2+4 talks. They said they wanted to still keep the German telecommunications under their control, under their surveillance, and Kohl thought it was not important because he did not understand what telecommunications surveillance is. I met someone from his office team and they said they were really upset about this and they finally organized to have, 8,000 pages of transcripts of his phone calls that the Stasi had made rolled into his office on 2 small caddies. And he said, hey, what the fuck is that? They said, oh, that's your phone calls in the last 10 years, including the ones with your girlfriends and your wife and your secretary and so on. So they made him understand what telecommunication interception is. And indeed these records from this intelligence do help people to understand what the intelligence is doing. So we could argue for full disclosure, and if we were to vote on that now, I wouldn't be sure if I would really oppose it. Julian, I don't want to talk about that so much, as obviously there are cases where if you're investigating the mafia, during the period of investigation you should keep the record secret. There are circumstances where this could be seen as legitimate. I'm not saying that as a policy it's legitimate, I'm saying that it's politically inevitable. There are such politically cogent demands for it, like, these guys have murdered before, they're plotting another murder, that regardless of whether you think that interception should be available or not, it's going to happen. You can't win that political fight. But this kind of tactical surveillance has the benefit that it can be partly regulated and the harm can be confined to a minimum number of people. When tactical interception is used for law enforcement, as opposed to intelligence, often it is part of evidence collection. The evidence ends up in court cases, and therefore it ends up public. So you have some oversight, at least some of the time, of what's going on. And you can interrogate people on the stand about how that information was collected and why we should assume it was valid. You can keep an eye on it. But regulation of strategic interception is completely absurd. It is, by definition, intercepting everyone. So what legislation are we going to apply if your starting premise is to intercept everyone? Jeremy, this debate about full disclosure makes me think of the group known as LulzSec, who released 70 million records from Sony, all the users' data from Sony, and you could see all the addresses, email addresses, and passwords. I think there were even credit card details from 70 million users. As a fundamental rights activist I thought, wow, there is something wrong here if to prove your point or to have fun you disclose people's personal data. I was very uncomfortable with seeing people's email addresses on the record. In a way, I thought those people were having fun with computer security, and what they were demonstrating is that a company as notorious and powerful as Sony wasn't able to keep its users' secret, And having those 70 million users search in a search engine for their email address or for their name and find this record would make them instantly realize, oh wow, what did I do when I disclosed this data to Sony? What does it mean to give personal data to a company? Jacob, then they shoot the messenger. Chapter 12. Rats in the Opera House. Julian, we've gone through all these pessimistic scenarios, so now I want to look at a potential utopian scenario. We have the radicalization of Internet youth, and now Internet youth is approaching the majority of youth. On the other hand, we have some desperate attempts at anonymization and freedom of publication, freedom from censorship. We have a vast array of state and private sector interactions which are fighting against that, but let's assume that we take the most positive trajectory. What does it look like? Jacob, I think we need the right to read and the right to speak freely without exception for every single person, not one single human being excepted, no exceptions whatsoever, to misquote Bill Hicks. He talked about this with regard to education, clothing, and food, but that's really what it comes down to. Everyone has the right to read, everyone has the right to speak freely. In that comes a right to anonymous speech, the ability to be able to pay people in a way where there is no interference from third parties, the ability to travel freely, the ability to correct data about you that is in systems. To have transparency and accountability for any systems where we see any sort of agency. NDY, I would add the thought that with the increase of information processing systems and the network side of it, and with the availability of tools like Tor and encryption and so on, the amount of data that can be suppressed is pretty low, meaning that governments need to just do that and they know it. They know that acting in secret these days just means acting for a matter of time in secret. It will be subject to public record sooner or later, and this is a good thing. This changes the way they act. This means they know there is accountability. This also means they actually force whistleblowing inside processes, like in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requiring companies which are registered in the US stock markets to have a whistleblower infrastructure, so that people who need to report criminal or other misbehavior by their superiors have a way to report it without being affected directly by those they are reporting on. So this is a good thing, and this will bring more sustainable processes in the long term. Jeremy, adding to what Jake just said, I think we must make it clear for everyone that a free, open, and universal internet is probably the most important tool that we have to address the global issues that are at stake, that protecting it is probably one of the most essential tasks that our generation has between its hands, and that when somebody somewhere, whether it's a government or a company, restricts some people's ability to access the universal internet, it is the whole internet that is affected. It's the whole of humanity that is being restricted. As we are witnessing that we can collectively increase the political cost of taking this decision, all of the citizens accessing the free internet can deter that behavior. We are beginning to see that as network citizens we have power in political decisions and we can make our elected representatives and our governments more accountable for what they do when they make bad decisions that affect our fundamental freedoms and that affect a free global universal internet. So I think we should practice that. We should continue to share knowledge about how to do it. We should continue to improve our ways of action, the way we exchange tactics about going to the parliament, about exposing what the politicians are doing, about exposing the influence of industry lobbies on the policymaking process. We should continue to build tools to make citizens more able to build their own decentralized encrypted infrastructures, to own their communication infrastructure. We should promote these ideas to the whole of society as a way to build a better world, and we are beginning to do it. We should just continue. Julian, Jake, if you look at people like Yevgeny Morozov's description of the problems in the internet, these issues were foreshadowed long ago by the cypherpunks. It wasn't a view that one should simply complain about the burgeoning surveillance state and so on, but that we can, in fact, must build the tools of a new democracy. We can actually build them with our minds, distribute them to other people and engage in collective defense. Technology and science is not neutral. There are particular forms of technology that can give us these fundamental rights and freedoms that many people have aspired to for so long. Jacob, absolutely. The key thing I think that people should walk away with, especially if there's some 16-year-old or 18-year-old person that wishes they could make the world a better place, is that nobody sitting here and nobody anywhere in the world was born with the accomplishments that they later have on their gravestone. We all build alternatives. Everybody here has built alternatives, and everyone, especially with the internet, is empowered to do that for the context in which they exist. And it is not that they have a duty to do it, but it is that if they wish to do this, they can. And if they do that, they will impact many people, especially with regard to the internet. Building those alternatives has an amplification, a magnification. Julian, so, just for you, if you build something you can give it to 1 billion people to use. Jacob, or if you participate in building an anonymity network like the Tor network for example, you help to build the alternative of anonymous communication where previously it did not exist. Jeremy, it's about sharing that knowledge freely and enabling communication channels for knowledge to flow freely. This is what you are doing. Tor is free software. It is as widely spread as it is today because we embed that notion of freedom in the way we build alternatives and build technology and build models. Jacob, we need free software for a free world, and we need free and open hardware. Julian, but by free you mean unconstrained, people can muck about with the internals, they can see how it operates. Jacob, absolutely. We need software that is as free as laws in a democracy, where everyone is able to study it, to change it, to be able to really understand it and to ensure that it does what they wish that it would do. Free software, free and open hardware. Julian, they had this notion from the Cypherpunks that code is law. Jeremy, that's from Larry Lessig. Julian, on the internet what you can do is defined by what programs exist, what programs run, and therefore code is law. Jacob, absolutely, and what that means is that you can build alternatives, especially in terms of programming but even in terms of 3D printing or social things like hackerspaces that exist. You can help to build alternatives and the key thing is to drive them home into a normalization process, one where people become socially very used to being able to build their own three-dimensional objects, to being able to modify their own software, and where they are aware that if someone blocks them from doing that then whoever is doing the blocking isn't providing internet access, they are providing a filternet or a censornet. And, in fact, they are violating their duty of care. That's what every single one of us has done with our lives, and people should know that they have the ability to do it for future generations, and for this generation now. That's why I'm here, because if I don't support Julian now, in the things that he is going through, what kind of world am I building? What kind of message do I send when I let a bunch of pigs push me around? No way, never. We have to build and we have to change that. As Gandhi said, you have to be the change you want to see in the world, but you have to be the trouble you want to see in the world, too. That's a line from A Softer World. It's not the same as the Gandhi quotation, but I think people need to know that they cannot just sit idly by, they need to actually take action, and hopefully they will. And I think we're seeing a good chance that people can proceed further on from where we are, and alternatives come from people who are unsatisfied with the situation they find or the options they have. Julian, can you talk a bit about the Chaos Computer Club in this context? Andy, always CCC, FNORD. Julian, it is unique in the world, actually. Andy, the CCC is a galactic hacker organization that promotes freedom of information, transparency of technology, and cares about the relationship between human and technological development, so society and development interacting with each other. Julian, this has actually become political. And why? The CCC has become like a forum of the hacker scene with a few thousand members based a little bit in Germany, but we don't understand ourselves as living in Germany, we understand ourselves as living in the internet, which is perhaps a big part of our self-understanding which also attracts. We are very well networked with other hacker groups in France, in America, and other places. Julian, and why do you think that this started in Germany? The heart is in Germany, it's expanded out to the rest of the world. Andy, Germans always try to structure everything. Jeremy, German engineering is better. Julian, but I think it's not just that. It's that this is Berlin and it's the fall of the East. Andy, it has to do with different things. Germany has done the worst thing a country can to do to others, so it is perhaps a bit more immune to doing those things again, like starting a war with other countries. We've done it all, we've been through it, we've been punished hard and we had to learn from it. And actually this decentralized thinking and anti-fascistic behavior, like avoiding a totalitarian state, is still taught in German schools because we experience that at the worst level. So I think that is part of understanding the CCC, which is a bit of a German phenomenon. War Holland, the creator who founded the CCC, also had a very heavily political approach to this. I saw his father at his grave, when his son actually died before him, and his father was not saying pleasant words. He said, and that there will never be any totalitarian, non-peaceful activities from German ground again. That was his father's comment when he buried his son, and for me that explained a lot about why war was so heavily into influencing and taking care of people, acting peacefully with others, spreading ideas and not limiting them, and not behaving aggressively but cooperatively. And the thought of cooperatively creating things like open source movements and so on has indeed been infecting and coming together with the thoughts of American cypherpunks and Julian Assange WikiLeaks and so on. This is a global thing going on now, which does have very different, very decentralized cultural attitudes of Swiss, German, Italian hackers, and that is good. Italian hackers behave totally differently than German hackers. Wherever they are, they need to make good food. With German hackers, they need to have everything well structured. I'm not saying the one is better than the other, I'm just saying that each of these decentralized cultures has its very beautiful parts. At the Italian hacker conference you can go to the kitchen and you will see a wonderful place. At the German hacker camp you will see a wonderful internet, but you better not look at the kitchen. Still, the heart of it is we are creating. And I think we find ourselves in some kind of a common consciousness which is totally away from our national identity, from being Germans or from being Italians or from being Americans or whatever. We just see that we want to solve problems, we want to work together. We see this internet censorship, this fight by governments against new technology, as some kind of evolutionary situation which we have to overcome. We are on the way to identifying solutions and not only problems, and that is a good thing. We probably still have to fight a lot of bullshit for the next I don't know how many years, but now finally there's a generation of politicians coming up who don't see the internet as the enemy but understand that it is part of the solution, and not part of the problem. We still have a world built on weapons, on the power of secret keeping, on an entire economic framework and so on, but that is changing and I do think we are very important in the policymaking right now. We can discuss the issues in a controversial way, and that is something that the CCC has managed for a long time, actually. We are not a homogeneous group, we have very different opinions. I appreciate that we sit here together and we don't come up with the best answers right away, we just come up with questions, and we crash our different ideas on the table and see what the bottom line is. That's the process that needs to go on, and that's what we need a free internet for. Julian, I posed the question of what the most positive trajectory for the future would look like. Self-knowledge, diversity, and networks of self-determination. A highly educated global population, I do not mean formal education, but highly educated in their understanding of how human civilization works at the political, industrial, scientific, and psychological levels as a result of the free exchange of communication, also stimulating vibrant new cultures and the maximal diversification of individual thought, increased regional self-determination, and the self-determination of interest groups that are able to network quickly and exchange value rapidly over geographic boundaries. And perhaps that has been expressed in the Arab Spring and the Pan-Arab activism which was potentiated by the Internet. In our work with Noraat.org, who created TunaLeaks, pushing the State Department cables past the regime's censorship into pre-revolutionary Tunisia, we saw firsthand the terrific power of the network for moving information to where it is needed, and it was tremendously rewarding to have been in a position, because of our efforts, to contribute to what was starting to happen there. I do not perceive that struggle for self-determination as distinct from our own. This positive trajectory would entail the self-knowing of human civilization because the past cannot be destroyed. It would mean the inability of neo-totalitarian states to arise in practice because of the free movement of information, the ability for people to speak to each other privately and conspire against such tendencies, and the ability for microcapital to move without control away from such places which are inhospitable to human beings. From those underpinnings you can build a wide variety of political systems. Utopia to me would be a dystopia if there was just one. I think utopian ideals must mean the diversity of systems and models of interaction. If you look at the churning development of new cultural products and even language drift, and subcultures forming their own mechanisms of interaction potentiated by the Internet, then yes, I can see that that does open this possible positive path. But I think in all probability tendencies to homogenization, universality, the whole of human civilization being turned into one market, mean you will have normal market factors such as one market leader, one second, a third niche player, and then stragglers that don't make any difference at all, for every service and product. I think it will perhaps mean massive language homogenization, massive cultural homogenization, massive standardization in order to make these rapid interchanges efficient. So I think the pessimistic scenario is also quite probable, and the transnational surveillance state and endless drone wars are almost upon us. Actually, I'm reminded of a time when I smuggled myself into Sydney Opera House to see Faust. Sydney Opera House is very beautiful at night, its grand interiors and lights beaming out over the water and into the night sky. Afterwards I came out and I heard 3 women talking together, leaning on the railing overlooking the darkened bay. The older woman was describing how she was having problems with her job, which turned out to be working for the CIA as an intelligence agent, and she had previously complained to the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence and so on, and she was telling this in hushed tones to her niece and another woman. I thought, so it is true then. CIA agents really do hang out at the Sydney Opera. And then I looked inside the opera house through the massive glass panels at the front, and there in all this lonely palatial refinement was a water rat that had crawled up into the opera house interior, and was scurrying back and forth, leaping onto the fine linen-covered tables and eating the opera house food, jumping onto the counter with all the tickets and having a really great time. And actually I think that is the most probable scenario for the future, an extremely confining, homogenized, postmodern transnational totalitarian structure with incredible complexity, absurdities, and debasements, and within that incredible complexity a space where only the smart rats can go. That's a positive angle on the negative trajectory, the negative trajectory being a transnational surveillance state, drone-riddled, the networked neo-feudalism of the transnational elite, not in a classical sense, but a complex multi-party interaction that has come about as a result of various elites in their own national countries lifting up together, off their respective population bases, and merging. All communications will be surveilled, permanently recorded, permanently tracked, each individual in all their interactions permanently identified as that individual to this new establishment, from birth to death. That's a major shift from even 10 years ago, and we're already practically there. I think that can only produce a very controlling atmosphere. If all the collected information about the world was public, that might rebalance the power dynamic and let us, as a global civilization, shape our destiny. But without dramatic change it will not. Mass surveillance applies disproportionately to most of us, transferring power to those in on the scheme who nonetheless, I think, will not enjoy this brave new world much either. This system will also coincide with a drone's arms race that will eliminate clearly defined borders as we know them, since such borders are produced by the contestation of physical lines, resulting in a state of perpetual war as the winning influence networks start to shake down the world for concessions. And alongside this, people are going to just be buried under the impossible math of bureaucracy. How can a normal person be free within that system? They simply cannot, it's impossible. Not that anyone can ever be completely free, within any system, but the freedoms that we have biologically evolved for, and the freedoms that we have become culturally accustomed to, will be almost entirely eliminated. So I think the only people who will be able to keep the freedom that we had, say, 20 years ago, because the surveillance state has already eliminated quite a lot of that, we just don't realize it yet, are those who are highly educated in the internals of this system. So it will only be a high-tech rebel elite that is free, these clever rats running around the opera house. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share and subscribe for more. Thanks for tuning in.